In the heart of the French region of Burgundy, the small town of Cluny holds a secret. Once a gigantic church stood here, now barely 1/10 of the original remains. In its day, it was the largest abbey in the world. Its pillars rose more than 30 meters. Its nave spans 60 meters longer than Notre-Dame de Paris. 300 windows illuminated the building. It was called Maior Ecclesia, Latin for the largest church.
It was an absolutely incredible technical feat. They managed to build something that was simply oversized for the era.
Built by 11th century monks in less than 70 years, it would remain Western Christianity's largest church for 5 centuries, defying all architectural standards and declared a second Rome.
It looked directly to the papacy in Rome for direction.
But after the French Revolution, this peerless abbey was abandoned, destroyed, and sold stone by stone.
The site completely deviated from the concept of an abbey.
For nearly a century, archaeologists and historians have searched for traces of the abbey in the walls of the city. They've discovered that the builders of this church had mastered extraordinary techniques.
And so they must have wanted to build very high from the word go. You don't build vast foundations if you're going to have a small church with nothing on top of them.
How did the monks meet the challenge of building such a tall and stately abbey almost 1,000 years ago? Where did they find the materials? How did they transport them? Now, the greatest experts on the Cluny Abbey, meticulous computer-generated reconstruction, and 20 years of hard work will reveal the lost secrets of the Maior Ecclesia. Cluny Abbey was located in a remote valley in the heart of Burgundy, in southeastern France. Within the walls of the lost religious city once stood the largest abbey ever built in the Middle Ages. More than 90% destroyed after the French Revolution, only a few vestiges remained, which were swallowed up by the city that developed over the centuries. How could one calculate the dimensions of the original church? What did it look like? Today, only the large southern transept remains with its octagonal tower, the last vestige that proves the once colossal size of the building.
Because it's the only bit of Cluny that's left, one forgets just how gigantic it is. And the transept that survives is, twice the size of the average church, isn't it, in its own right? And it's only one of 2 transepts.
The dimensions of the tower were unheard of for a building from the Middle Ages. It was more than 60 meters high and overlooked the valley. The interior vaults measured up to 30 meters. This tower awakened the curiosity of historians to find the plans of the missing abbey. Only one existed, preciously preserved. It dates from 1700 and was made by an anonymous person. The precision of the drawing is the only trace of what this extraordinary church was like.
This is the oldest plan of the abbey, the earliest testimony to its existence in Cluny. It was a huge monastery. To give you an idea, from the end of the 11th to the 12th century, it housed approximately 300 monks. At the height of its existence, Mont Saint-Michel had only 80 monks, so it was truly colossal in size.
The abbey was a veritable city that stretched over 15 hectares, almost half the size of today's Vatican, with buildings that were oversized for the time. Some are still visible in the city, such as the Miller and the Inn. Yet the highlight of the map that intrigued the researchers was the size of the abbatial church in the middle.
When you look at the scale of the large abbatial church, you see that it was colossal. It was 187 meters long. To put it into proper perspective, it was 60 meters longer than Notre-Dame de Paris.
The church was bigger than Notre-Dame de Paris, St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, Chartres Cathedral, and the Basilica of Saint-Denis. In size, it beat any other church in the Middle Ages. Its unrivaled length held double aisles, 11 spans, 2 transepts, a small and large with a width of 75 meters, a chancel, and an apse composed of multitudes of radiating chapels named apicidiole. To understand the size of this monumental church, we must go back to the time of its creation, which began with a key asset.
The location on the site itself is linked to a donation made in 1910 by the Duke of Aquitaine. He gave a plot of land, an old villa, to a handful of monks. But he had the distinction of placing this community under the direct responsibility of Rome.
It was directly subservient or looked directly to the papacy in Rome for direction. So it considered itself, in a sense, I suppose, to be a second Rome.
Its direct attachment to Rome gave it a privileged status, but the abbey became even more important a few years after its creation, thanks to a specific event.
They brought relics to Cluny, first of St. Peter and St. Paul, and then relics in numbers such that Cluny competed with St. Peter's Basilica in Rome and gave rise to a very large veneration of relics.
One could come to venerate the relics of St. Peter, or at least pray around the abbey. It was a bit like making a pilgrimage to Rome. I'm slightly exaggerating, but not much. There was a very strong connection to Rome.
The first church, called Cluny I, quickly became too small. The monks built what was named Cluny II, a little larger, but 20 years later, this church was deemed to be too narrow. They then built Cluny III, the Maior Ecclesia, or biggest church.
The idea was to build a church that could perhaps accommodate up to 1,000 monks, or at least a very large number of them that were either on-site or passing through.
It was absolutely vital to have something more imposing that was really in the image of this second Rome.
They wanted the best, the greatest, the most beautiful, and the brightest to manifest their faith in God, but also to show his strength and his power, and that the greatest, be they emperors or even the Pope, should do that with Cluny.
At one point, Rome could not do without the Cluny Abbey. The abbot of Cluny was an essential person in medieval Europe of the 11th and 12th centuries.
Abbot Hugh of Semur launched the construction of Cluny III, the Maior Ecclesia, in 1080. His goal was to build the largest church ever, but the monks were immediately faced with a problem: the location. How could a huge church be built on a cramped site at the junction of 2 rivers and on the steep slope of a valley?
The site where Cluny was built wasn't very good for construction. In fact, it was somewhat of a flooded basin. To the east, there was the Rhône River that flooded often, creating silt. The soil was very unstable up to the level we're at now, where natural terrain began.
The heart of the church had to face east, towards Jerusalem, so the monks had to level the hillside to create a base by removing thousands of cubic meters of earth.
These were considerable earthworks. They had a bit of difficulty since they were perpendicular to the slope of the hill and, consequently, were forced to carry out a number of works to try to get it leveled.
There were layers of land that were not very homogeneous, and the eastern parts were still quite wet. That's why they built extremely strong foundations.
You need solid foundations to build high. The Cluny monks understood that very well. The chapel of Jean de Bourbon at the extreme southeast of the abbatial church was redesigned in the 16th century. Excavations are underway to find the ancient foundations of the abbey, led by Fabrice Henrion, an archaeologist at the Center of Medieval Studies.
What's quite extraordinary is that we're in the foundations. This is extremely well-designed and well-built masonry. And yet it wasn't visible, but in the ground, buried in the foundation trenches. It's a very high-quality construction.
The limestone blocks are perfectly cut. Their thickness varies from 6 to 18 centimeters, and they're connected by mortar.
The foundations were deep because the builders looked for hard ground to use as a base. Here, they were really trying to make deep, solid foundations in order to bear the weight of the whole structure.
The depth of the foundations followed the slope of the valley to reach the hard rock, up to 4 meters deep in certain places. They were also extremely thick. On the western part of the transept, the foundation wall was 5 meters wide.
From the start, the foundations were colossal. They're big and they're very deep on a site which is not easy to build on. And so they must have wanted to build very high. From the word go, you don't build vast foundations if you're going to have a small church with nothing on top of them.
To stabilize the foundations, the monks went even further. Each wall and each pillar base were connected by 3.5 meter thick masonry. All the structures were firmly anchored to each other.
These walls were brought together, including those under the arches. So from one wall to another, or from one pillar to another, were foundations that followed each other. It's called a sill plate, which is a kind of grid.
This grid stabilizing the soil was a way of connecting the support points that these pillars represented. Once it was done, you could build whatever walls you wanted.
If the ground moved, the entire building moved, but it wouldn't fracture. There lies the genius behind the construction.
Engineers from l'École nationale des arts et métiers did a simulation and realized that these foundations had enormous purpose. Had they not been there, the monument wouldn't have stood.
At the beginning of the 20th century, an archaeologist also took a keen interest in the foundations of the lost church. American Kenneth John Conant would change the fate of the abbey.
When he arrived, everything was under grass. There was no sign of foundations or anything like that. The only thing that survived was the great transept and the little eastern transept and the Chapelle Jean de Bourbon and so on, that little group of buildings. But apart from that, there wasn't anything really visible.
The site had completely taken over the area. It was a little like the Khmer temples, where vegetation invades the temples. In Cluny, the city took over the area, completely surrounding the abbey.
The site had completely deviated from the concept of an abbey. So Conant worked for nearly 40 years to find not only the plan, but to reconstruct the lost volumes of this exceptional building.
Using rare artist drawings from the 18th century showing the abbey and its church, Kenneth John Conant had only one obsession: to find the exact dimensions of the building. To do so, he analyzed the foundations, their thickness and their composition, finally drawing hundreds of plans which revealed the abbey in volume for the first time.
Conant was the one who rediscovered the Cluny Abbey. He was the first to have proposed reconstitutions of the abbatial church in all its original and later splendor.
Through his research, Conant discovered the entire size of the building. The nave of the church was composed of a double span, punctuated by 18 monumental pillars. It also featured a transept, itself followed by a smaller one. Finally, there was the chancel, with 10 pillars that formed an ambulatory. Three floors of windows bathed the church in light. And the vaults were 30 meters high. In the 11th century, no other church matched it in height and dimensions. It was the largest, highest, and brightest. But how did the monks manage to create such a masterpiece using the techniques of the Middle Ages? The 10th century was the golden age of Romanesque art. Churches were modest in size, not exceeding 20 meters tall, with thick walls and small windows, far from what the monks wished to achieve.
The churches of the 11th century were darker, usually because their windows were cut into the walls of the tribunes. The naves were rarely lit directly.
The churches were rather squat. The monks of Cluny decided to raise the walls, to build very high vaults, and to add many windows.
At the time, the vaults had a semicircular arched shape, typical of Romanesque art. The semicircles supported the weight. The diameter was therefore equal to the width of the vault. The height of the vault was the radius. To increase the height, the nave had to be widened, but the bigger it got, the more the forces at hand weakened the structure. To build higher, they had to find a solution other than the semicircular arch.
They were driven by the necessity of solving this technological problem to guarantee the stability of the building. At one point, the genius idea of using Gothic arches must have come into the mind of the site manager as a way to solve this issue.
The Gothic arch is two half circles with centers located at the extremities of the vault. They intersect, and this forms a Gothic arch. The width is no longer related to the diameter as it is for the semicircular arch. It can reach 2/3 of the arch. It's therefore possible to build higher than with a semicircular arch.
The Gothic arch existed before Cluny. It wasn't conceived specifically for Cluny, but it was used because of its interesting characteristics. In the Romanesque style, all arches were systematically semicircular. For Cluny, however, they could not be used for reasons of stability.
At that time, it was quite innovative because it would allow the weight to be better distributed over fully vaulted parts.
With semicircular arches, the weight is evenly distributed horizontally and vertically. This requires thick walls to prevent them from spreading under pressure. By breaking the arch into two half circles, the horizontal component of the weight is reduced and carried over to the vertical component. As a result, the walls can be thinner and higher without the risk of spreading.
From the moment these walls could be higher in elevation, they could also be cut more easily to create bay windows. It was these openings that allowed light into all the vessels that made up the nave and the aisles of Cluny III.
It's clear that behind what appears to us to be essentially new forms, there was above all technological research at a level we would deem quite advanced today.
But Gothic arches were not enough to flood the nave with light while maintaining the stability of the building. It is this church plan that allowed the architects to grasp the level of mastery with which the Cluny Abbey monks understood the balance of forces.
This is a cross-section of the large nave of Cluny III. It was composed of a central aisle and a double aisle. The forces were redistributed by staggering the aisles. This shared distribution of lateral force was achieved through the stability of the outer walls with powerful buttresses. So it was a massive structure, but a particularly well-balanced one.
There was a genuine effort made to understand these forces. These people displayed an exceptional level of conceptualization. There was a clear architectural and engineering approach.
Typical of Romanesque art, the central naves were buttressed with aisles. Here, the size of the building is such that the monks added a third aisle, maintained by powerful outer buttresses. The monks pushed Romanesque art to its limits. The 3 floors of successive Gothic arch vaults rose to 29.5 meters, 17 meters, and 10 meters, allowing for a perfect balancing of forces. It was then possible to cut rows of windows on each floor. These windows represented a 45% void compared to the walls.
There were several rows of overlaid windows, which obviously allowed them to create an unrivaled luminosity inside. This is to evoke another spirituality, that of the divine, that floods the place of contemplation with his light.
At that time, people didn't dare open walls under vaults like this, especially in a building as important as the Maior Ecclesia. So this was very important and very bold, and it foreshadowed what Gothic architecture would later become.
In Gothic art, the structure carries the building, not the walls. In Cluny, the monks pushed the thought process of force distribution to an extreme, in order to exceed the heights allowed in Romanesque art, right down to details essential to balance. This is notably the case with the position of the pillars.
This narrowing, very subtle at each level, allowed the springing point of the vaults to be brought into the design of the building, and thus offer more stability. And so the oblique lateral strain was better contained in the design of the building.
The building was a balance between force applied vertically and horizontally, buttresses, arches, and the position of pillars. Everything was present to allow the monks to build a gigantic church. However, because the building was also subject to torsional movement, the monks paid attention to the slabs that supported the top floor.
There was a whole system of staples that actually locked the inner bands, the last band at the top of the transept. So all the parts were actually sealed by these metal staples.
These were large staples, 50 centimeters in length by 2 centimeters in width and across. The building was so large that they had to take every precaution and resort to any technique imaginable to achieve stability and avoid deformation.
But that wasn't enough. The monks were still concerned about the pressure put on the walls by the vault. So they placed large iron bars along the entire length of the nave.
So across the transept, there were these bars of metal which held the thing taut. These huge tirons de fer had to hold the walls from falling outwards, you know?
If they did it, it was because there was a need. So it's clear that the building called for this kind of buttress. The project was rather bold anyway.
Everyone in the Middle Ages knew Cluny, and the builders of the great cathedrals knew it too. They knew what the advantages or disadvantages of various strategies were. That's why the Gothic arch implemented in Cluny was reproduced in the great cathedrals. The use of iron with staples was used in Gothic architecture, and so on.
The abbey was splendid, grandiose, and impressive. The first stone was laid on October 25th, 1088. The monks began with the southern arm of the great transept, the only part that remains today. The site then moved south to north, and then to the west. On the walls of the church, you could see a multitude of holes left by the workers' scaffolding. These are called put-log holes.
Put-log holes are small orifices that were made into the wall at the time of construction. That's how they could stack the beams, trays, scaffolding, and so on.
Their location provides information on the evolution of the construction site, notably the part that survived the destruction, the large southern transept of the abbey. We can see that the put-log holes, which are aligned horizontally on the first two spans, are not on the third. There is a difference of 30 to 40 centimeters. This is a sign that construction stopped. What happened? If we look at the third span in more detail, the three highest windows are not aligned with those just below. Moreover, the band that marks the floor suddenly stops and does not continue on the third span. All of these clues help us understand what happened on the site at that time.
There was a change of purpose. At first, they set out to build a vaulted church with 20 meters under the vaults in order for it to be lit directly. But at this stage of construction, in the middle of the transept, they decided to build 10 meters higher. Plans were changed. You can clearly see it in the transept.
The first dome was 20 meters high, the second 30 meters, and the third was supposed to have been 20 meters high. But the monks decided to go higher. By placing this third dome 30 meters high, they were forced to shift the windows to the north to leave room for the support pillar. In their dream of gigantism, raw material was essential, and in that respect, the location of the abbey was perfect.
For materials, it was perfect. Everything needed was on site, both in abundance and quality. That's exceptional. There were limestone quarries. If you cook limestone, you get lime, which is the binder needed to build. They had sand from the Grone River and large quantities of clay to make the floors, tiles, etc. Not to mention the valley was completely covered with forests.
Near the construction site, less than 3 kilometers away, were a multitude of quarries with an abundance of stones. The farthest one was 18 kilometers away. It's the last still visible today. The monks extracted white limestone called pisolite limestone.
We're here at the Lye Quarry. This is one of the rare sources of soft stones in the region. We know that stone was extracted for sculpture.
The other quarries were composed of hard stones used for construction. There were 3 types of limestone with different physical characteristics: micrite, oolite, and crinoidal. There was also arkose, a kind of sandstone.
The programs were deliberately very bold in terms of budget and technique, so they looked for the best stone possible, large sheets of bedrock that could make big walls.
The most beautiful stones were cut directly on site and placed so that they were visible on the exterior.
The walls were made with 2 facades that were relatively similar, with rubble stone cut more or less finely depending on the area. And in the middle was a mixture of coarse mortar with all types of stone waste to create a stable, uniform block. The wider it was, the higher it could go.
It was an absolutely incredible technical feat. They managed to build something that was simply oversized for the era, with fairly simple means, as the walls were made with basic rubble. That's how buildings had been constructed since antiquity.
From these quarries, the monks extracted a single stone 6 meters long, 3 meters high, and 45 centimeters thick, the tympanum. It was placed at the entrance of the large gate to impress visitors.
It was an extraordinary block in terms of size, considering the supply at the local quarries. Then it had to be moved, which was also a technical feat. The idea was to use intelligence rather than strength.
To carry the stone, the monks installed a ramp that compensated for the slope of the valley over 10 meters in elevation. The tympanum was then rolled on logs to the large gate. It was then lifted up using a hoisting device called a jack, which reduced the weight of the stone by a factor of 100, using the principle of traction levers. The 28-ton stone was then placed on its base.
This huge tympanum was lifted vertically on these jambs and was then sculpted. They didn't want to take the risk of creating that sculpture of Christ in his glory before setting it up and digging into the mass of the tympanum. Because of the 45-centimeter thickness, they dug up to 40 centimeters to give depth to the sculpture.
Christ was surrounded by 4 angels whose remains found on the site show a quality of sculpture that was unmatched at the time. In certain areas of the tympanum, only 5 centimeters of stone thickness remain.
From that moment on, an immense gate was built that measured 14 meters wide at the base and 20 meters high. An arcature was placed at the top to complete the composition. This huge gate was hence designed as a genuine triumphal arch. This was really in line with the idea that Cluny would be restoring the ancient world and Rome.
The quality of the sculpture was just breathtaking. When you came in through the west door under that lintel, that, you know, and all the sculpture of the west door, and you looked down the whole length of the church, what you saw was the enormous Christ in the apse painted.
There were more than 1,200 capitals inside, which entails a gigantic number of high-quality decorations. These were large capitals, 80 centimeters wide by 80 centimeters high. It was a colossal building, the scale of which was quite remarkable.
Only 8 capitals were found almost intact. They adorned the pillars of the ambulatory in the chancel. Here again, the sculpture was carved with a lot of depth so as to play with shadow and light.
The majority of the capitals had Corinthian themes. They were modeled on Corinthian capitals. The reference to antiquity was tremendous.
In antiquity, you had temples with columns and Corinthian capitals. In the Cluny III, they replicated the colonnade and borrowed Roman marble columns that they trimmed and installed around the chancel. So Cluny III was representative of ancient Rome in all its splendor.
Above all, the monks wanted monumental architecture. With their 2-meter diameter, the vestiges of the pillars that punctuated the nave bore witness to this desire. The choice of the stones that composed them wasn't the result of chance.
They didn't put just any stone in any place. The base of the first pillars was made of micrite limestone. With moisture, the open transept and the destruction, these stones degraded. Next was a mixture of arkose and limestone. Why did they use micrite limestone, which is not particularly known for being of good quality? Well, that stone is interesting because it's very resistant to compression. What was above it was extremely heavy. The pillars, the vaults, the dome, all weighed on the pillars. So they chose this stone to support the vertical load.
Likewise, when the composition of the walls of the still existent transept is analyzed, each stone has its function. At the base, micrite limestone to support the weight. In the middle, strong and rigid sandstone. And at the top, soft limestone for the sculpted capitals. At this point, 30 years had passed since the first construction of the great church La Maior Ecclesia. The Cluniac order was at the height of its power.
The abbots were in permanent contact with the emperors, sovereigns, leading figures of the world, and the papacy. The abbey couldn't be overlooked.
Gradually, they created what we called an empire. They called it a religious order, but it truly was an empire. Today, for a company or a firm, it would be called an empire.
It was an abbey that had subsidiaries, so to speak, and throughout Europe. From England to Italy, from Spain to Poland. It had an enormous influence. Spiritual, of course, but also temporal.
More than 800 monasteries were created and directly attached to the abbey. The order was based on the rule of St. Benedict, a return to spiritual life and prayer. It resonated with world leaders.
The abbots also put into place an entire strategy around the worship of the dead, the feast of the dead, and the need to pray for the dead. They multiplied the altars, held more and more masses for the souls of the deceased, and in each mass, obviously, the coffers of the abbey increased.
Cluny had vast wealth at this time and certain great sponsors. And it clearly was the kings of Leon and Castile, their great gold treasury, the tribute which came to Cluny annually from the northwest of Spain, meant that the coffers at Cluny were bursting. And this incredibly ambitious church project was undertaken.
Cluny had colossal means. It was a building that was erected very quickly.
Perhaps too quickly, because in 1125, an event changed the structure of the building.
In 1125, the vault of the nave allegedly collapsed.
One of the vaults most likely collapsed. We don't know where.
It could be the great nave, it could be an aisle, it could just be a little aisle, or a chapel or something. You know, it's not at all clear.
Obviously, the monks were devastated. Their dream of greatness and prestige was ruined.
The monks had to review their plans and determine what happened. How could a building that had been so well thought out be fragile? What was the mistake?
They didn't anticipate the fact that the nave was very long. The entire length of the nave had been built using the same vault and the same walls. But given that length, there was a certain flexibility to it. For example, if you take a pencil that's 5 centimeters long and you try to break it, that's hard to do. But with a 30-centimeter pencil, all it takes is a little snap and you break it. So what did they do in the Middle Ages? They constantly monitored the vaults.
The monks placed steep and narrow staircases in the thick walls of the abbey, approximately 40 meters in height. From there, the monks could control the structure. They might have noticed that the vaults were fragile despite all of their precautions.
What we do know is that they reinforced the vault with walls called buttress walls in order to transfer some of the weight and stabilize the vault of the central aisle. And to avoid having massive walls that would change the perspective a little, an arch was hollowed out in them.
The arches thus counterbalanced the forces applied by the vaults onto the walls. These arches would later emerge in Gothic churches as flying buttresses.
Cluny 3 was really the transitional building between typical, classic Romanesque art and Gothic art that would flourish a few decades later. It's traditionally believed that Gothic art was developed in the Parisian region, and indeed, most of the great monuments of this period are concentrated there. But the genius of the techniques that allowed Gothic art to blossom really took place in Cluny around 1130.
In 1095, Pope Innocent II came to consecrate the church. It wasn't entirely finished. The last stone wasn't laid until 1130. But as soon as it was completed, the monks decided to build a 38-meter long narthex that would end with 2 large towers called barabans, culminating at 17.5 meters. There was a problem. The hill had to be dug once again to integrate the extension.
They wanted the narthex to extend into the hill. The topography of the site and the choice of location made by the monks at the end of construction led to the fact that one entered the church by going down the steps, thus bowing to the Saint of Saints, represented by the magnificent chancel of Cluny 3.
It was in Cluny that the legendary narthex was created, an antechurch located right in the front of the nave called Galilee, because it refers to a very specific liturgy pertaining to Easter and the observance of Easter.
Easter celebrates the resurrection of Jesus. In all its grandeur, the front of the narthex symbolized the passage to eternal life. The abbatial church was finally finished. It had risen from the earth in less than 70 years. It imposed its power by its gigantism, dominating the center of the abbey. This religious city was surrounded by walls. Its ramparts rose to more than 8 meters and were made of defensive towers and gates.
The walls of the abbey weren't there simply for the prestige. They were also meant to protect in case of an attack, and there were several. And then you had the city around the abbey, along with the walls of the city. So the abbey was a small town within the town of Cluny.
When the abbey expanded, the fortifications were enlarged as well, and gradually, by expanding, it brought more and more people to these sites. Pilgrims had to be accommodated, so a hotel was built. Visiting guests needed accommodating too. We tend to forget that an abbey isn't just a church, a cloister and a few buildings. It's an entire economic and cultural complex.
Very quickly, the question of water arose. How could it be provided to the community? The monks resorted to two rivers located on either side of the abbey, the Médasson and the Gronne. But this required making adjustments.
The Médasson is a small stream that originated west of Cluny and was channeled under the city of Cluny. It was used for the hydraulics of the monastery and part of the city. The water from the source of this stream was transported into the monastery as drinking water. It was brought to the fountain of the cloister, and from there, water was distributed to the kitchen, to other fountains, and perhaps to the baths.
The monks used gravity. The slope went from west to east, and the Médasson flowed naturally into the Gronne. The fountain of the cloister that received the water was the highest in the abbey. Once filled, it supplied the various locations. Using the drop in elevation, the monks increased the pressure and made the water gush. The Médasson also served as sewer water. A parallel network was to be created, evacuating sewage.
There were sewer systems that were several hundred meters long. Running water was injected into them to carry away the waste. There were flushing systems upstream of the monastic latrines, which were large longitudinal buildings. In these upstream systems, the valves were opened and the fecal matter was sent further downstream.
Very quickly, the abbey expanded towards the Gronne, and the monks diverted the course of the river. They set up water retention ponds upstream and downstream of the river by building 5-meter-high and 370-meter-long dams capable of holding 200 hectares of water. In doing so, they created a diverted canal that ran along the valley and irrigated the entire abbey. It was one of the most complex hydraulic systems ever built in the Middle Ages.
Cluny took a natural water system and changed it into a completely artificial network. There was no natural water passing through the city or the abbey at all.
The monks set up 187 mills along the Gronne and inside the abbey, which brought them a colossal income. It was one of the greatest seigneuries of the Middle Ages.
In the Middle Ages, mastering water was of course a sign of power and technological know-how. The monks of Cluny were no exception. Beyond the domestic dimension, there's a spiritual dimension to water that helped demonstrate the richness of the abbey.
The Cluny Abbey prospered for 5 centuries thanks to a succession of powerful abbots. The abbey started to decline in the 15th century. In the 16th century, it was no longer attached to Rome and lost a large part of its income. In 1789, the French Revolution brought about the end of the abbey with its sale in 1798.
The abbatial church was sold in lots to material traders and developers who, stone after stone, patiently dismantled the entire building. In this huge church that was a masterpiece of architecture, they only saw a pile of stones that would allow them to get richer.
The town encroached on a large part of the abbey, namely the land located close to the village. As a result, there is currently an interweaving between the current town and the historic buildings of the abbey. The site completely deviated from the concept of an abbey.
Strolling through the city, one can see a multitude of medieval houses, some of which have pieces of the great abbey in their walls.
In the masonry of the houses and in private-owned gardens, we often see elements of a sculpture, a piece of capital, a fragment of a portal, or a statuette that came from this great church.
Over the centuries, the abbey was transformed. A new cloister was built on the site of the old one in the 18th century, as well as l'École des Arts et Métiers. The gardens were redesigned. But Cluny's great abbatial church lives on, scattered around the city. This architectural prowess in gigantism still radiates through its vestiges.
It's true that relatively little remains, but there is enough to get an idea of what the abbey was like if one takes the time to look and really study.
As a site, Cluny has to be earned. It isn't just handed to you on a silver platter. You have to dig. And when you're given the opportunity to do so, you'll find it's wonderful.
Every detail immerses you in the glorious past of this prestigious order. It's thanks to the power and fervor of the abbots that the abbey was able to compete with the greatest buildings to the point of being compared to Rome. By wanting to create bigger and higher, these monk builders advanced the architecture of the Middle Ages. Today, all you have to do is let yourself be carried by these premises to understand the scale of this project and its challenges.